I'm going to talk about scheming defaults, and if I know one person knows what that means, but if you don't, you will by the end of the talk. Yeah, scheming user defaults. That's what I'm talking about. So, user defaults, what are they? Well, it's NS user defaults. You've probably used it before for a lot of things. Known as the defaults systems, but that's when they're referring to OS X. Set user defaults. Well, you can do it programmatically. You're probably all familiar with that. You can do it with runtime arguments. You might not be familiar with that. And with the settings app, which I'll show. So, the domains. So this is kind of how it works under the hood a bit. It's in the documentation. So there's an NS global domain, which I tried to find out if it did anything on iOS, and I don't think it does. I think it's an OS X only thing, but it's still available. But then there's also the arguments domain, which are the ones that come from your application's arguments. So that makes sense for OS X applications, especially terminal applications. But you think, what arguments are people passing to my iOS app? And the registration domain is for temporary defaults, so they're not saved to disk. But what you can do with that is sort of pre-fill your defaults with default values. So if you're not familiar, this is settings, and this is a custom settings bundle that lets you sort of create your own pane in settings app. And if you do that, you can put some values in there. That's how you make it. You have to create a settings bundle, and there's a plist that describes the UI. You should probably edit the XML. It's better than the property list editor, sorry. And here's runtime arguments. So that's, I don't see it used too much, but I use it a lot. So what you can do with that is you can create arguments whenever you want, just in your scheme, and you can load those through user defaults as well. So this is how you register the default values. So something I do is have a plist file that has all these defaults in the resources, and then you can just load that up when you start the app. Now to talk about schemes. So schemes are those things. You're probably used to those being auto-created. If you haven't gone and played with the UI for schemes, I recommend it. There's a lot of really good features in there. So here's where you set the arguments. Once you edit a scheme, there are these 4 tabs. And the arguments passed on launch is what I'm interested in. And you just add it there. So the syntax for this is dash key and then a value. The other tabs, just out of interest, are info. This is where you can change the build configuration that the scheme runs. Options, which has some cool core location simulation. Application data bundles, which hasn't worked since Xcode 7. Had to mention it. And there's a whole bunch of options you can look at yourself. And diagnostics has a ton of really good debugging features. So look at those. So you put those together. So you might have an application that has some kind of configurable API URL for your backend. So what you can do is provide a default in code or in a property list in your resources. You can also have an option in your settings app, which you probably wouldn't include that in production, but if you have a testing team or just for your own purposes, you can put an option in the settings app so that you can dynamically change what API you hit. And you can also create a scheme that overrides that value. So often I do this, where I'll have the default scheme, which I leave alone, but then I'll duplicate it and create schemes for the different environments that I'm testing my app in. And that's just what it looks like. So that's the production scheme, and then that's the staging scheme. And so when I run the app from Xcode, and if I've selected staging scheme, my app will run and hit staging. Just a note on sharing schemes. So you've probably shared a scheme before trying to get a build working on CI. Well, the reason that works is it makes the schemes not need to be generated when Xcode opens. So if you've changed the runtime arguments, if you want that to be committed to Git, you need to share the scheme. Conversely, if you're sort of mucking around, breaking things, or you've just got some preferences there that you don't want your team to have, feel free to not share it, and they'll appreciate it. So back to scheming defaults, I guess. Or actually, that's it. Sorry. I have one more slide. Thank you. Yeah, I'll post these notes on my GitHub. I'll never get around to writing a blog post about it on my blog. Yeah, but I'll post the code. I can show an app if the pizza's not here yet. I don't see. Oh, let's just have pizza then. Okay. No demo. Thank you. Questions? Yes, sorry, I didn't mention that, but there is a sort of priority order to the user defaults. So arguments will override anything. So that's the highest priority. If you've set a user default in your arguments, your runtime arguments, that will always be used, which is really what you want, because if you're running it from Xcode, trying to debug staging or something, that's what you want. After that, it's whatever's been set in the settings app, and then after that, it'll use your registered defaults. And after that, it depends on what method you're calling to get values out of user defaults. So if you do for key, the default, if it can't find the value, is nil, which gets converted to no. The same with strings and stuff like that. So actually, be careful with that. You can instead use object for key, and that will return nil. So you can check for the existence of the key that way. Well, there's probably another method to just check for the existence. I don't know. I just say object for key, because then you have the object and you can get the value out.